modern stage, on today's stage. I would like you to know some of the old ones that you may never heard of. In order for you to understand where these people, the important people we're going to study today, where they come from, we're going to show a chart and see where this whole thing starts. As you can see, actually, Italians are the first one who started the school of violin playing. You can see. Maybe I should go on the other side, so Rosalie can take a picture of this. It's famous Corelli. Corelli is the one who did many violin sonatas, and some of you probably played this. He has given a lot of important students like Somis, like Claire, Pugnani, and one of the most important students on Corelli line is Viotti. Viotti is the father of French violin schooling, even though he was Italian. But they call him father of the French violin schooling. Why? Because he came to teach at the Paris Conservatory somewhere at the late 700s. And he became a teacher of the very famous violinists whom you've heard and whose etudes you probably all played. He became a teacher of Baillot, Kreutzer, and Rodet. How many of you played Kreutzer etudes? Raise your hand. Okay, so you see, you're familiar with Kreutzer. And how many of you played Rodet? Rodet Caprices. Okay, you're familiar with Rodet. Now look, their father, they called it Father Viotti, was the one that they emulated. Meaning they looked after him and they tried to play like Viotti. They tried to imitate Viotti. They learned so much from Viotti. That's a Paris Conservatory. Now, Kreutzer and Rodet and see, from Rodet came very famous German violinist Spohr. And also Kreutzer, student Massart, and later Marsic became the teachers of famous Wieniawski and Vietan. So when you're talking about Italian, French, and German school, keep in mind that they're not so separated. They're all kind of blended. They're all kind of merging one from another. And as you can see, Wieniawski was in return teaching Isai, and also his teacher was Massart and Marsic, who came afterwards to France, to Liège, and became great teachers of the Belgian violin school. So you see how this whole thing merges one from another. It goes, one merges from another. It just goes all the way back to Corelli and even back to French violin playing. But let's say it starts from Italy, from Italian players, from Corelli. And if you can remember this map, or maybe I'll give you a copy of this, so you know who is successing whom, who is a follower of whom. You can see Isai, his student Alfred Dubois, and then Arthur Grimiot. How many of you heard Grimiot play? Okay, so Grimiot is also follows the footstep of Isai. Then Menuhin with Persinger, who was the student of Isai. And you can see from there we have Ruggero Ricci, Isaac Stern. This all goes from Persinger, English school, who is tracing back to Isai, and Isai tracing back to Wieniawski and Vietan, Wieniawski tracing back to Massart, Massart to Kreutzer, and Kreutzer back to Viotti. So you see the chronology, you see the pedigree chart, or what we call maybe genealogy chart, sort of. This is how it's happening. But I would like today to tell you about some most prominent figure in violin playing who made a history. And I chose to tell you about Joseph Joachim, and then I would like to tell you about Isai, because those are the figures of violin playing who made history. All of them were such fantastic players that they inspired composers to write pieces for them. So let's start with Joachim. And the things I would like to tell you about him, I prepared a lot, but I'm sure the time will be too short for me to tell you so much. So I'm just going to read selectively what I prepared here for you. Yeti, do we have anything on Joachim?
You mean
Playing?
recording? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to first hear Joachim play, and then we're going to analyze and tell you a little bit about him. You can see here picture of old Professor Joachim. something that we don't hear today. Today, we can do this, yes, or maybe.
Oh, that's ours.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. As you could see in the chart, if we go back, Eji, to the chart, can we go back? You see that the line that Joachim represents, he is the representative of a German school, but you see how back it goes. It goes back to Viotti, and it actually goes back to the Paris Conservatory French schooling of Kreutzer and Rodet. Why? Because you see, Spohr was one who also was influenced by Rode, Kreutzer and Baillot, who also had part in the Paris Conservatory. Now Ferdinand David, who was the student of Spohr, became the teacher of Joachim. That's how we consider it. But if you really read his life, Joachim had great influence. I mean, David had great influence on Joachim just by being with him, playing with him, and so Joachim learned from David by observation. And David was another great violin teacher. Maybe those are the names that you have to remember: Ferdinand David and Joseph Joachim. Now, why is Joachim such a great figure? Although David is also a great figure, he has violin studies, and student 10 volumes of violin books, volume studies that I suggest sometimes in your life you should look at. It's absolutely fantastic. But Joachim was also a fantastic player, as you can see, inspiring player. His teacher, let me put my glasses and I will tell you. His teacher was Hungarian-born professor of the Vienna Conservatory and former teacher of the famous virtuoso Ernst. So Ernst, who is a great virtuoso, violin virtuoso, brought Joachim, who was younger than Ernst, brought him to Vienna Conservatory to Professor Joseph Bohn. So he was the teacher, really, of Joseph Joachim. And the old tradition of German playing was picked from Joseph Bohn. And Ernst, who heard young Joachim, insisted that he studies with Bohn. Also, another figure in music that had great influence on Joachim was Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn. Have you heard of him as a composer, Felix Mendelssohn? Yes. He is another one who, when Joachim was 12 years old, was sent to Leipzig to enter the conservatory. Mendelssohn himself examined him, accompanied him in Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata, and asked him to do some harmony exercises. The verdict was, this boy needs no conservatory. That's how great of a player he was. He said, this boy doesn't need conservatory. Let him play occasionally for Concertmaster David. I myself will endeavor to play with him. He should study composition with Hauptmann, and above all, get a good general education. This is how impressive he was. This is what Mendelssohn was saying about him. For the next 3 years, Joachim followed Mendelssohn's plan. He coached some repertoire with Ferdinand David, though he never called himself David's student out of loyalty to his old teacher Karl Bohn. He studied Spohr, Bach, Ernst, and much Paganini. The strongest influence was undoubtedly Mendelssohn, who played sonatas and chamber music with the boy every Sunday and insisted that an artist should only play the best. And he always admonished the boy never to change a single note in the work of a great master. He called such changes unartistic and barbarous. Mendelssohn, also a friend of Joachim from Spohr, prejudiced against Sautier, the bouncing bow, which was tradition in the German school that they didn't bounce the bow very much. So they really didn't know spiccato and Sautier and all these bowings. But Mendelssohn is the first one because the music he was writing required spiccato and Sautier and light bowings. It was a different music than the old German music. So Mendelssohn told him, come on, lighten up. use more vibrato, bounce your bow, you can do it, even though it's not in the tradition of German schooling, but you can do it. So Joachim started to do it, even though he was very much against it. I must tell you that he was against virtuosity. In those days, there were great virtuoso players, like, of course, Paganini, and there was Ernst, and later Uwe Bull, and those are all emphasizing playing emphasis in their playing was on technique. But Joachim was advocate of musical playing. And mere virtuosity just for the sake of virtuosity was not something he liked. So, also, what else can I tell you? All the artists before him were advocating playing their own music. They liked to play their own pieces, their own compositions. But Joachim was playing other works also. Now, I like to tell you that the one composer who wrote almost all violin music, dedicated his music to Joachim, was, guess who? Johannes Brahms. Brahms was the one. He was a great friend of Joachim. And all the pieces that have been written, including the violin concerto, including all the small pieces that Brahms wrote, sonatas, all the chamber works, were going through the hands of Joachim first. And many times Joachim didn't approve of it. He didn't really, in those days, understand the greatness of Brahms, because Brahms was a symphonic composer and was not a violinist. So some of the things Joachim found unviolinistic and unplayable, including his concerto. And lots of work that he has written among chamber music works, he burned, meaning Brahms burned it, because Joachim didn't approve of it. And it's Clara Schumann, the wife of famous composer Schumann, who insisted on Brahms saving those works, and thanks to her we have some chamber music today that otherwise Brahms would burn, because he trusted so much Joachim that every time Joachim was displeased with his composition, Brahms would burn it. Like the famous string quintet that he has burned, and then of course Clara insisted of Brahms rewriting it for two pianos, and I'm sorry, for the version of string quartet and piano. But it was originally for two pianos. The original version was all strings quintet, but it was burned. And somebody restored it actually in the 20th century. We played it. We performed it and recorded it, the restored version. Let's see, there's so much I want to tell you about Joachim. He was a very strict, dogmatic teacher, but his playing was so beautiful. It was based on German traditions of playing, with influence of French schooling, as you see on the chart, influence of Chrysler and Kreutzer and Rode, but yet very German, very following the traditions of German schooling and German opera. And he was famous for his portamento, his glissandi. And it's later on another virtuoso violinist changed that way of shifting. But Joachim had a very specific way of shifting. Almost every shift was used as a musical means of interpretation, was used as a musical shift. For him, there was no transportational shifts just for the sake of, playing the passage or playing, just using to shift from one position to another. Every shift he used for a musical point of view and making it very musical, every shift, which is a good lesson. We don't need to go to that extreme today, but we should always also remember that whenever possible, we should make our shifts very musical. Like today, whoever played the swan, right? I showed you how you can use those shifting techniques as a musical means of expression. And that's that's exactly what Saint-Saëns had in mind when he was writing, because he heard all these great artists who used shifts as a musical singing tone and form of expression. Also, another thing, he used vibrato very sparingly. In those days, in German tradition of playing, and in terms of what Brahms heard as a composer, when he wrote music for Joachim, he heard this all with very sparing vibrato, not too much vibrato. And then, of course, Joachim, towards his later years, older years, he changed that and he started to vibrate more, because there were young artists came on stage like Isai, and he heard Wieniawski play, and they all used much more vibrato, they developed it, and of course, Joachim resented it, but he acknowledged that this is beautiful, and this is how the music should be played, especially music of Brahms. When we play music of Brahms today, we use much more vibrato than it was originally used by Joachim. I should read to you what Joachim said. It's very funny. He said this. Just one sentence. I will, if I can find it. I will find in another place, but I will tell you this. He said, I've heard the vibrato that Wieniawski uses. I've heard the vibrato Isai uses. It's a lot of vibrato. It's beautiful, but I hate it. Yeah, so this is how he resented, because he didn't follow the tradition and his opinion of good taste. But he acknowledged that this is how it should be played. The era of playing turned into romantic era, and so he could use a little more romantic idioms and romantic language of violin playing. Okay, now can we hear a little bit more of Joachim? And pay attention to those things as you listen. Yeah. Well, I hope you enjoyed this because you're never going to hear playing like this today. This is very unique, but so beautiful. What I like about this playing is the timing. Besides the beautiful sound and the portamento, which we think today are a little bit exaggerated, but the timing, how he starts, you know, this is just how you're not going to hear this from today's virtuosos because they're all after, you know, they have technical problems, they're all after showing technique, but he was really after musicianship, and you can see how he influenced the future generation of violinists. And when I speak to Ida Handel, which I'll tell you later, she always says, I like to take things slow. Why? Because her teachers, Carl Flesch and Escu, were the ones who played things slowly. They were after the expression and interpretation and not after the speed. And you can see that's exactly who Joachim was. For him, musicianship was above everything. Now, do you know also that Schumann dedicated concerto to him? Schumann violin concerto was dedicated to Joachim. And if I read to you, in 1853, that was an important year for Joachim. He accepted the post of Royal Music Director of Hanover. He intensified his relationship with the Schumanns, and he met Johannes Brahms, who was to become a lifelong friend. Then he played the Beethoven concerto under Schumann's baton, and Clara noted in her diary, and I would like to read that to you. She said, Joachim was the crown of the evening. He celebrated a victory greater than any of us, but he played with such poetry, such perfection, with so much soul in every note, really ideal. I have never heard violin playing like it. Never before did I receive such an unforgettable impression from a virtuoso. And this is famous Clara Schumann, pianist, the wife of Schumann. The following day, Clara and Joachim played Schumann's violin sonata in A minor, and he performed with such beauty that, according to Clara, only then did I fully understand the work of Schumann. And it was last creative year of Schumann's life. It was the last creative year of Schumann's life, and the deepening friendship with Joachim played an important role. With Joachim in mind, Schumann had composed a fantasy for violin and orchestra, and modestly asked for Joachim's opinion. During my work, I have often thought of you. That's Schumann telling Joachim. He said, this is my first effort of this type for the violin. Write and tell me what might not be practical in it. I also ask you to mark the bowings in arpeggios and elsewhere. The cadenza is not the final one. I plan to replace it sometime later with a weightier one, with a heavier one. Joachim played the first performance of the fantasy in Düsseldorf under Schumann's direction in October '53 and received the dedication of the printed score. However, another late work of Schumann, the violin concerto in D minor, written for Joachim, remained unpublished in those days. Schumann's mental collapse on February 27, '54 prevented him from carrying out some planned revision. That's not important for you. Joachim had first encountered Brahms in 1853 when Joachim was 22, Brahms barely 20. So see, Brahms was younger than Joachim. They met in Hanover, it's in Germany, where Brahms had arrived as accompanist of the Hungarian violinist Reményi. And this is a long friendship, as I said. From then on, everything Brahms has written for violin was dedicated to Joachim and inspired by Joachim. This is how fantastic this figure was. And he inspired many younger violinists later. Okay, now we're going to go and jump to the French school. I will tell you about Ysaÿe. In the next time when we have this workshop, I will talk about Wieniawski. That this deserves the whole hour because Wieniawski was really the father of what we're learning today. He was the father of this Leopold Auer schooling and all this what you think is called Grupma technique, that was Wieniawski. But that I'm going to dedicate the whole hour to. Now I'm going to go back to the French school on the chart, if you can see, forgive me, and where you're going to see where the Izai comes. The Izai comes from Franco-Belgian school. French because it comes from the line of Kreutzer and Rode and Bayeux. And Belgium because Vietnam and Wieniawski in the late years of their life worked in Liège, in Belgium. And that's where Izai learned. From them he learned. Okay, let me tell you something about Izai. Can we first hear Izai's playing? Yeti?
Yeah.
Thanks. a fantastic playing, really. And also because recording is old, I'm not sure what is really technical discrepancy there. You know, sometimes when you listen to the Skype also does the same thing. So it could be also the pitch is higher and it goes from translating from this to YouTube and stuff. Anyway, I want to make a link between Joachim and Isai. How did Joachim and Isai meet? Once, when Isai was barely 21 years old, he was unknown outside the Belgium and Paris because he was from Liège. He was born in Liège. But once arrived in Berlin, he paid a courtesy visit to Joachim because, of course, Joachim was a legend. And so Isai wanted to visit him. So Joachim was a musical oracle of Berlin. And Joachim asked him to play something. And Isai casually picked up Joachim's Stradivari and played Vietnam's Fantasia Appassionata, followed by the Wieniawski Concerto in D minor. Joachim was so overwhelmed by this new young genius. A few days later, he brought a group of his students to the Flora to admire that splendid fellow. Flora was the place where he played. Brought it there to admire this splendid fellow. Thus, Isai's career was launched, but it was to be a slow rise. His arrival on the musical scene came at a slow time. Vietnam was gone, Wieniawski stood at the end of a brilliant career. Joachim, though not quite 50, preferred quartet playing to solo performance. The only competitor was Sarasate. That was the competitor of Isai. So Sarasate, whose graceful playing was quite different from the emotional power of young Isai. Soon Isai gained an admirer in Anton Rubinstein, the pianist, famous for his grand style, and the two artists went on concert tour to Scandinavia and Russia in 1882. Of all living violinists, only Isai reminds me of Wieniawski. That's what Rubinstein used to say. Well, I'm telling you this because I want you to know that at the beginning of Isai's career, he had a French bow grip, of course, because he was a student of Liège with Massart, and Massart, who wasn't the Rudolf Massart, but Lambert Massart, who was the student of Vietnam, but he was a student of Rudolf Massart, the nephew of Lambert Massart. So he had very, very French school with no influences of Russian playing or Wieniawski's playing or anything like this. But his tone was very small because he suffered the bow grip. He was very nervous when he played on stage. He has tremor, had tremor, and when he would get nervous, they consider this a French curse, or how did they call it? I forgot, but that's something that they had in common with other French violinists because their bow grip was in a way not so relaxed that they had tremor when they were nervous. So, and he was praised for his beautiful playing, but they were saying that he didn't have a big tone. In fact, I'm going to read to you a little thing that says, curiously, Isai was not born with the great tonal power that he displayed later in life. Sam Franco, an American violinist living in Paris at the time, tells that in 1877, when the 19-year-old Isai played an audition for the conductor Pas de Loup, he arrived at the hall accompanying his maitre, renowned Vietnam, who took pride in his student's accomplishment. Using Vietnam's Amati violin, Isai played the Mendelssohn Concerto. Pas de Loup, known for his rudeness, turned to Vietnam and said, "No, I can't let him play. He has no tone." But let's see. Nevertheless, he was a great influence on people like Chrysler, great influence on people like Thibault, Jacques Thibault, and Enescu, and many, many violinists. He was a great influence on them. They all imitated his playing because it was so beautiful. And this was a far extreme criticism that his tone was small. Because in his life, in the middle of his life, somewhere he realized that he needs to have a little bigger tone for big halls to match the famous Wieniawski, who had a huge tone. So he took some lessons from Wieniawski, who taught him this bow grip, this one that we're using, right? He taught him also vibrato, different vibrato. And so Isai, at his later years, what you saw the picture here is his later years. He changed it to this, what we think is Leopold Auer's bow grip, but actually it goes from Wieniawski. It comes from Wieniawski. So see how the Russian schools and French schools are intertwined? This is really where it comes from. And the first one was Wieniawski, and Wieniawski was representative of Liège, of French school. And this is how the Russian technique of Leopold Auer, what we think, came actually from Wieniawski and entered into the Franco-Belgian school. Even Vietan, who was teacher of Wieniawski, also learned from Wieniawski and changed his bow grip because Wieniawski influenced him. And so did Isai. And he started to play differently. And his tone was bigger. You know that, let's see, for an artist to change his tone quality in mid-career is not as unusual as it may seem. David Oistrakh, for example, began to produce a larger, fattier tone in 1940s. For Isai, a changing repertoire may have induced him to employ a more forceful bow stroke. The needs for a bigger sound. This is what repertoire change demanded, the need for bigger tone. He expanded his programs by including the powerful concertos of Brahms and Elgar, demanding a big tone to counterbalance a large orchestra. Now I will tell you a little bit about Isai's vibrato. Isai's vibrato, which lent his tone its inevitable color, was described by Kreisler, who revered Isai. He said, Wieniawski intensified the vibrato and brought it to heights never before achieved, so that it became known as the French vibrato. Vietan also took it up, and after him Isai, who became its greatest exponent. And I, Joseph Joachim, disdained it. That's the phrase I was trying to find, but I found it now. That's what Joachim said. So he acknowledged that Isai, who became the greatest exponent of this beautiful vibrato, but I disdained it. Joachim incidental, thin flowing quiver only on expressive notes. In other words, a very sparing use of vibrato. The French vibrato of the later 19th century, pioneered by Isai and the Kreisler, became wider and was used more abundantly. Yet Isai warned of excessive use of goat-like bleeding. He said, there are 1,000 sounds, but only one is perfectly in tune. Open your ears, search it out, and then don't alter it by nauseating vibrato. That is to the violinist what the goat, she says chevrotement. Chevre is a goat. So chevrotement is to a singer, so not to use excessive vibrato. A sound warning against the hysterical vibrato of some modern violinists. Now, one more thing I need to tell you. Another expressive means of Isai was the portamento, also called glissando or slide. This technique was widely used and misused in the earlier 19th century, condemned by critics as cat-like meowing. Ernst was accused of overdoing such expressive slides. Isai perfected the technique by which a finger moves subtly into a tone from below. Not as much a shift from one position to another as a sensacious expressive device similar to the method of fine singer in reaching a high expressive note. Thibault used this type of slide and became the hallmark, and this became the hallmark of Heifetz. So when we call this shifts, Heifetz shifts. You remember what I say, Heifetz shift. It's when you're doing vibrato not from the top, but from the bottom. You shift not with the finger that played last, but you with the higher finger you slide it into the note, which he calls here, the author of this book calls it from below. But what he means is this type of vibrato, Heifetz, the pa, pua, instead of pa, ya, right? This is what Isai started, and of course Heifetz perfected it. When you come to Heifetz's home, he had two pictures, two people that he admired. One was Chrysler, and another was Isai. Those are his what is the word I'm trying to use? The idols that he admired and that he emulated. Karl Flesch stressed the originality of style in Isai's playing. He says, tempo rubato was Isai's credo. Yet, while he took rhythmic liberties, he urged his accompanists to keep time without following each of his slight deviations in tempo. Have no fear, we'll always find each other. He reassured the pianist De Clores, with whom he played. Whenever I accelerate certain notes, I establish the equilibrium immediately by slowing down the following notes or broadening one of them. That's what Isai says. Nevertheless, Isai was criticized by purists for errors in judgment and taste, because you always have those who criticize. He emerges a masterful interpreter of the classics, and I need to tell you that pieces like Sonata by César Franck, do you know who that was dedicated to? How many of you know Franck Sonata? Was dedicated to Isai. Also, pieces like Chanson Poème was dedicated to Isai. And by César Franck, this is what Isai said about César Franck Sonata. This work, he said, was given to me, the composer, as a wedding present almost 40 years ago, and whenever I play, I do so with love. This is what happened. Now, Isai himself was a composer. He composed sonatas, and I'm gonna challenge you to find out how many sonatas and who they're dedicated to. Yedi played today one of those Isai sonatas. And do you guys know who it was dedicated to? Yeah? Do you know? Was dedicated to Chrysler. Yeah. So he dedicated his sonatas to different, not pupils, but colleagues who are younger than him, who he admired greatly. And Enescu played at his masterclass. The masterclass he gave, one of his masterclasses, and the end of the masterclass, Georges Enescu came modestly to play Isai solo sonata in D minor, dedicated to him. It was a moving experience. It was Sonata Ballade, number 3. You know this one, right? That was dedicated to Enescu, who was young and adored Isai. Okay, we go on. Now, we're going to hear a little bit of Chrysler's playing. Because I want you to really know who Chrysler was and how fantastically he played. I won't have time to talk about him much. Yeah.
this is Dan.
Anyway, this is one of the greatest figure of violin playing, revered to be even larger figure than Heifetz. He was 10 years old when he came to Paris. He was born in Vienna in 1875. So at the end of 19th century, basically. He came to study at the Paris Conservatory, entered the class of Lombard Massart. And who had Massart was Wieniawski's teacher. So the thing is that much later Kreisler said, I believe Massart liked me because I played in the style of Wieniawski. But Massart knew a talent when he saw one, and he is said to have written to Fritz Kreisler's father. He said, I have been the teacher of Wieniawski and many others, but little Fritz will be the greatest of them all. So that's what he thought. He even surpassed Wieniawski. Whether Massart was capable of teaching Kreisler the French vibrato, as you could see, he had this developed beautiful French vibrato, which was intense but not overwhelming. It was energetic vibrato, but yet really subtle, not overwhelming. We call it French. Whether Massart was capable of teaching Kreisler the French vibrato, the intensely sensuous tone color first produced by Wieniawski is a question. Kreisler was too young to have heard Wieniawski. So, but perhaps he acquired it through Isai, who had studied with Wieniawski. So, see the link here? He heard Isai, he followed Isai, and Isai heard Wieniawski, and here is one of the greatest figures of violin playing, Fritz Kreisler. Okay, in the orchestra he didn't make it, and guess why? Because he had this beautiful vibrato, and in orchestras they think that his playing was too soloistic, and that his vibrato will be sticking out in the orchestra, which is nonsense, of course, but in those days they used vibrato so sparingly that they thought that he's gonna stick out, and didn't let him play in the orchestra. And later he played with the Vienna Orchestra under the baton of Hans Richter, the same orchestra, Vienna Orchestra, that didn't invite him to play with them in the group because they thought he's too soloistic. He appeared as soloist. And, okay, yeah. Then he played as soloist with Berlin Philharmonic and with Isai in the audience, and Isai loved his playing. He applauded it. Okay, what else I need to tell you? That Elgar Concerto, violin concerto, was dedicated to Kreisler, and he premiered it with the London Royal Philharmonic in November of 1910. So at the beginning, at the verge of 20th century, it's when he performed it. He was wounded, by the way, because he was in the Austrian army during the Second World War. And lots of people resented him because he was an Austrian soldier. And one of them was Jacques Thibault. And he became a citizen of the United States in 1943. And I need to gallop. This is what the author thinks, that he was not the greatest technician of his time, but simply the strongest musical personality expressing himself through the violin. Grace, vitality, rhythm, taste, the ability to turn an unforgettable phrase, these were the characteristics of Kreisler's performance. His tone quality was absolutely unique, no matter on what violin he played. His technical equipment, very commanding in his youth, declined over the years, but it was secondary importance. In the words of Berlin critic Adolf Weismann, Kreisler has developed a new type of virtuosity to the highest perfection. He has imbued his playing with a human feeling that no one else attains. That's all I'm going to tell you about this. Oistrakh, David Oistrakh said, Isaiah was the first to play the violin with a really beautiful sound. He began to reminisce about the people he knew in Russia and with whom he was friends. Rachmaninov, Kusevitsky, Stefanov. While I was there, he said, a beautiful city. I remember I wanted to play something new for the musical public, that city, but I never heard anybody play like Kreisler. Okay. Though his tone was not that large, his tone had unique carrying powers because his bow did not choke the natural vibrations of the string. There was a resilience to his bow presence. The coloration was achieved by the left-hand vibrato, which he said originated with Mirinyavsky and Isai, but was more nervous and high-strung in his own case. He vibrated not only sustained notes, but also faster passages, notes, even passages which lost all dryness under his magic touch. This is what we're kind of teaching you to do too, is to vibrate, especially those fast virtuoso notes. They are especially, those notes are in need of making them alive, making them sing, are the fast notes in playing. And that's what Kreisler was the first one to do this way. And he sustained the vibrato also. He was the first one to really sustain the vibrato. Isai started it, Kreisler continued, influenced by Kreisler. Okay, at the end I would like you to hear a little bit of a French violinist who I personally love very much. It's Jacques Thibaud.
Color, a highly personal way of savoring each note, distinguished the style of Jacques Thibaud, the most famous of French violinists. Menuhin spoke with great admiration. Color, a highly personal way of savoring each note, distinguished the style of Jacques Thibaud, the most famous of French violinists. Menuhin spoke with great admiration of his inborn ability to handle a phrase without asking permission of the metronome. By the way, until now, there is a competition, international violin competition in Paris called Queen Elizabeth, Jacques Thibaud competition. After him, because he's a legendary violinist of France, always revered as the biggest French violinist.
Symphonie représentait souvent le seul témoignage visuel sur les interprètes qu'elle mettait en scène. Émile Vuillermoz et Jacques Thibaud firent tourner certains de ses films en double version. L'une avec illustration visuelle, l'autre montrant simplement l'exécution de l'œuvre musicale. À titre d'exemple, voici l'autre version, la version concert de l'une des cinéphonies que nous vous avons présentées, La Fontaine d'Arétuse.
read to you what Enescu said. Enescu was 1 year younger. Sorry? Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm just going to read what Enescu. Enescu was his student, but no, not his student. I'm sorry. He was his fellow student, which was his peer almost. Thibaut was only 1 year older. He says, "I was 15 when I heard him for the first time. I honestly admit it took my breath away. I was beside myself with enthusiasm. It was so new, so unusual. Thibaut was the first among violinists to reveal to the public an entirely new sound, the result of a complete union between hand and string. His playing was marvelously tender and passionate. Compared to him, Sarasate was just a cold perfectionist." To quote Viardot, who was the French critic, who said, "Sarasate was a mechanical nightingale, while Thibaut, when he was in good form, was a real live nightingale. I pity all young violinists who have not heard Thibaut. In their book of memories and irreplaceable images is lacking." The mutual admiration of Isai, Kreisler, and Thibaut was notable. Isai once said, "There are two violinists from whose playing I can always be certain of learning something, Kreisler and Thibaut." Yeah, Thibaut is one of my favorites among all of those that I played for you today. We didn't have time to go into Carl Flesch and his students because it would take another hour, but I wanted you to know these people. Those are fantastic violinists, and I hope you can search more and learn more and find more about them and hear more of their playing. I can only ask you one question. What does all people have in common? Except for Joachim, who we couldn't see how he played because it's a very old German school. But what is it that they have in common? And look at their bow arm. What did we see? They all have in common. Do you see that they play like today's modern violinists, which is like this? None of them play like that. So I want you to know one thing. If you ever go out of this area and you go study elsewhere and they tell you you don't have correct bow arm, always tell them, how about all these great masters? They never played like this, and yet they play beautifully. And look how beautiful their tone is. So you don't really have to have stiff wrists and fingers apart and hold here in order to produce tone. In fact, you're going to be stiff and you're going to suffer. But these people really knew, whether they were French, whether they were Belgian, whether they were Russian, whether they were Polish, they knew how to play the instrument, and all of them played similarly to what you're playing and how your teachers are teaching you. So you have to be proud of it and stand your ground. Don't try to shy away. If you go elsewhere and somebody tells you, "Oh, your bow arm is horrible," who taught you that? I said, I learned from the great masters, which are Kreisler, Isai, Thibaut, even French masters. So if they say, "Oh, you have to play in the French traditions," well, we said, this is a French tradition. Look how he plays. Just go and learn. Okay?
Thank you so much, everyone. Aren't we so grateful to have seen and heard all that we heard today? Thank you. So there's so much more, even just on YouTube,
Yes.
right? So everybody, you have your list of great masters from this lecture, right? And you have YouTube at home, okay? So take it home and watch and study and just, we only touched on a few things today, but there's so much to learn, and we're so grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you. We want to pass around the list. I think Yeji has this list.
Yeah, we did. That's the list I'm talking about. So
Yes, and you can search them on YouTube, and you can learn more about them and read books. Some of the things you're going to find on Wikipedia, but very little. So you have to do more research. But basic thing is just listen to it. Try to learn how they play. Try to emulate, to copy how they play. Try to strive for this kind of sound and this kind of musicianship and expression. And let they be inspiration to you. This is my goal.